Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome an accomplished professional, a fellow member of the YPO from Lugano, Switzerland, Mr. Gerardo Segat. Gerardo, welcome to the show.
Hi, Yash. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Sure.
Gerard is an international leadership coach and a showrunner. He's the host of the show Out as Humans. He is the creator of Preludes, a coaching program created to humanize leaders and organizations. And as I mentioned, he's a fellow member of the YPO. So Gerardo, before we talk about leadership and all the other things that you're doing, tell me about your own journey in brief.
Well, I worked for 20 years in the family office industry as a CEO and entrepreneur. And then in 2016, I exited my business and requalified as a coach with the ICF. So since 2017, I worked as a leadership coach with the purpose of humanizing leaders and organizations. Over the past decade, I've been a member of YPO. I have chaired chapters, founded chapters there. And I just love learning by creating. So as a coach, I created the corporate coaching program, a postgraduate training program, a format of corporate decision-making debate. And my latest creation is Out as Humans, which is a performing arts show that I feature for company, leadership organizations, associations to uplift the humanity and authenticity of leaders.
Amazing. Thank you. So now let's talk about leadership. And when I was preparing for my conversation, I was fascinated with what you call the 4 inner treasures of a leader. What are these 4 inner treasures? And please help me understand with an example if possible.
Well, the 4 inner treasures, you go straight to the end. The 4 inner treasures of a leader are meaning, love, freedom, and certainty. And probably the easiest way to actually understand that is flipping them into negative and, thinking about and looking at the common fears that leaders have. So being meaningless, so having no meaning in your life or in what you do. Loneliness, which is, feeling lonely or being lonely or fearing to feel lonely now or in the future or ending up alone. Dependency from something or somebody and uncertainty. So if you think about, we all have somehow at different levels those 4 fears. And if you flip them into positive, you get to the treasures, which are inner love, inner freedom, inner certainty. And
Very interesting, very interesting. And Gerardo, what role does self-awareness play in accessing the 4 inner treasures?
Well, self-awareness is a requisite, let's say, the starting point. Self-awareness is about thoughts, is about emotions, is about skills, but it's also about fears, and is also about vulnerabilities, is also about treasures. So it's really what is needed to get to those inner treasures.
Fascinating. And how do the 4 inner treasures impact a leader's ability to inspire and motivate their teams?
Well, the treasures really liberate that ability up to the maximum potentiality of the individual. And that's because when you are ruled by fears, the consequence is harmful defensive behaviors. So just think about, we do it all the time, from shouting, from having a loud discussion in the office to pressing buttons to launch missile. All these behaviors, wearing masks, judging, postponing, ignoring, blaming, destroying, all these kind of behaviors are defensive behaviors from fears. So getting to those inner treasure really it takes away those fears, takes away those harmful defensive behavior, and therefore liberates the ability to inspire.
Very interesting. And in your view, can the four inner treasures help in times of crisis? And if so, how?
Absolutely. The answer obviously is yes.
Yeah.
Definitely help, big help, because those treasures, so inner meaning, inner love, inner freedom, inner certainty, when you get to those, the consequences are, I'd say, mainly three that are relevant for time of crisis. And those are radical positivity, radical humanity, and radical clarity. So positivity means, the ability to always spot the positive in everything. That's very important in time of crisis. Humanity is obviously has to do with human skills, with what we call soft skills, and I like to call human skills.
Right.
Obviously very important. And clarity is, particularly important because you're able to create magical spaces and situations such as turning impossible to possible, or spotting win-win solutions to problems. And again, that's very important in time of crisis.
Interesting. So let's now move on to another part of our conversation, which is applying leadership from the world of performing arts. And my first question is, what are some key leadership lessons that can be learned from the performing arts?
Well, from my experience, I entered the world of performing arts without knowing anything about it. Now, I've been there for a couple of years now. I think that those lessons are mainly I call them the four the four I's. So those four are imperfection, improvisation, intimacy, and imagination. So imperfection has to do with embracing imperfection, which is, very, very common and normal in the world of performing arts.
Right.
Improvisation is very much into theater, into performing arts.
Right.
You even have certain type of theater, which for example, are called improv theater, that has to do specifically with improvising.
Right.
Intimacy, obviously, and imagination. Theater, performing arts work somehow in a completely opposite way to business. Business normally go to the end as quick as possible, get to, give that message, give that idea. Theater, completely opposite, open, and give space to people.
Well said. And how important is storytelling when it comes to leadership? I know how important it is in theater.
Well, storytelling is one of the most powerful way to connect with people. So that's why it is important. It is a way to connect immediately and strongly with people, and therefore have an influence. When you connect, you can then influence.
Right. So my next question is, what insights from the world of performing arts can help leaders foster creativity within their teams?
I think that the way that you foster creativity is by making people feel authentic themselves, their true self.
Right.
So I think authenticity is very important, because then this creates the possibility of creating also diversity and inclusion. And therefore, authenticity means each one is their true self. So it really strengthens diversity and inclusion. And, I go back to the example I mentioned before. One of the, I think, most interesting way to foster creativity, if you want as a business to foster creativity using, the word of performing arts, is improv theater. So improv theater is really, and they actually do courses for companies for that purpose, not only creativity, also other things, but specifically creativity. So basically, improv theater is theater based on improvisation. So you suggest a topic, and people in the company create a show around that company.
Well said. My next question is that how can the discipline and preparation required in the performing arts be applied to leadership?
I see the strongest situation I see, and it was for me, in my experience, was the moment just before the start, the preparation to a topical moment, no? And think about in business, if you need to give a speech, if you're pitching, so how to prepare for that during that moment, just the moment before that topic event. And performing arts has a lot of attention to well-being, physical well-being. So even, when you prepare for a show, you have a physical preparation to that. But it's not only physical, it's also emotional, is spiritual, is mental, obviously. So a lot of focus on preparation for a topical moment, and that's individual, but also as a group. So just before performing, in performing arts, there are things that you do as a group to maximize then the performance.
Well said. So we'll move to now another set of questions, which are overcoming some of the most common ultimate fears of a leader. And I know you've done a lot of work in this area as well. Gerardo, what are some of the most common fears faced by leaders? And how can they identify and confront these fears?
Okay, so what I'm going to say might not be perceived as the most common.
Yeah.
But the reason is very simple. What happens often is that, we all have fears. We don't always try to get to the ultimate fears, okay? Those fears and, fears of failure. Think about fears of failing, fears of no purpose, no meaning, fears of, those are kind of, most common fears. Fears of dreaming, for example, dreaming big. Now, those are intermediate fears, okay? So if you continuously ask yourself, okay, why do I have that fear? Why do I have that kind of harmful defensive behavior from that fear? You get to 4 ultimate fears, which I, briefly mentioned to you before. So the most common ultimate fears of leaders are meaningless, so being meaningless, loneliness, dependency, and uncertainty, depending from somebody or something, and uncertainty.
Well said. And another fear that maybe there is inadequacy. How does that affect leadership performance?
with every fear, there are harmful defensive behaviors as a consequence. So just think about, if you feel inadequate, the chances that you postpone things, ignore people, or ignore methods, hide, yeah, escape situations, the chances are very big. So all these behaviors obviously have a big impact on your leadership and the way you perform as a leader.
Well said. My next question is, how can leaders transform the fear of rejection into a source of strength?
Well, I think the most important message is that there isn't one recipe. There is your recipe, okay? I think if you look, at the kind of methodologies that are there, you probably see two different approach. One is what I call the bullet train, and the other one is the regional train. So the bullet train is a typical coaching methodology. So you take that fear and you flip it over into the positive. No? So say you fear inadequacy or rejection. So you go and look for acknowledgement, okay? And so you just flip it. It's bullet train, go straight to the positive. The regional train, what I call regional train, is a methodology with steps. So you start by being aware of that fear, and then you get to peaceful acceptance of it. You look at you analyze the consequences that fear has had on you and on other people, and you amend those negative effects that your fear and your behavior has had, and then you look into how you can change that, and then you take action. So it's a more gradual approach with steps, let's say.
Fascinating. So, Gerard, we have time for two more questions for you. My next question is, what role does vulnerability play in overcoming leadership fears?
Okay, vulnerability is the core of authenticity. Okay, so vulnerability is actually, I think, the accelerator of overcoming fears. Is when you get to there and you are aware and accept and show yourself for who you truly are, then it really accelerates your the path to overcoming those fears and finding your inner treasures. It's also the other important aspects of vulnerability is that it is contagious. Okay, so if I am vulnerable and I show myself vulnerable, then other people will do the same. And this is how you can actually impact any kind of community, not only your company, your business, but any kind of community you're in.
Okay. Again, you also have done work on public speaking and you're in the theater. Can you share for our viewers and listeners some techniques to manage the fear of public speaking?
Oh, well, there are several. Again, there is what works for you, not, a general best one. I think, the fear is really selfish, okay? So it's really something that you have, and it is something that means focusing on yourself, okay? So one way is really to shift that focus from yourself to others and think about what you're actually doing and what you are trying to achieve and the fact that you're trying to have a positive impact on people and how that impact would make those people feel. So shift from yourself, from selfish to the others. Obviously, there is practicing, preparation. Practicing also helps overcoming that fear. Imagining a positive outcome of your speech, what you will do, is also something that has to do with as a positive impact. And also even some doing some small little physical action, like think about when you're winning, or other situations that make you feel stronger when you go and do public speaking.
Well said. And my last question for you, can you share a personal experience of overcoming a significant leadership fear?
Well, I'm no different from everyone. So,
Absolutely.
I mean, those ultimate fears I mentioned, meaningless, loneliness, dependency, and uncertainty, I've had, and I still have here and there in different proportion. If I can think about a situation, I had a kind of a difficult youth, and that difficult youth, which is somehow traumatic for me, really put blinders on me that I wanted to become a successful entrepreneur. So when I actually got there, and I was lucky enough to get there with my previous work for family offices in the family office industry. When I got there, I saw an empty space. It was a place that there was no meaning for me, and so I had to take a decision to say, okay, I'm gonna have to get out of this place, okay. And I was fearful. It was like a leap in the dark. But then I thought, okay, stop looking for outside objective, like, money, people, more offices, more money, more this, and, start looking for something inside. So meaning, inner love, inner freedom, inner certainty. And that really helped me to say, okay, I'm going to take this leap in the dark, and also set an example to my kids and say, I think I should get to those treasures, and also to find a way to impact the world rather than, so think big and think doing something good for others.
What an amazing story. Thank you for sharing this. And on that note, Gerardo, thank you so much for speaking to me. I think my conversation with you on leaders, leadership, fears, failure, the 4 eyes of leadership has been absolutely eye-opening, and I'm sure my viewers and listeners will really enjoy everything that you have told us about leadership. Thank you again for speaking to me, and good luck.
Well, thank you, Ash. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.